3 ways to combat social media usage. And also, because social media usage is so similar to the usage of other dopamine traps like junk food, we will also briefly discuss these other parts as well, these other parts of our lives. So now, here are the 3 ways, and then we will go over the 3 ways and actually discuss them in more detail. The first way is to just avoid it completely. Try to avoid it as much as you possibly can. That's the first way. The second way is to try to live with it and to allow a certain usage of social media, for example, or a certain usage of junk food, or a certain usage of anything else that makes you crave, makes you do the thing you didn't intentionally want to do, and should just allow it within our lives and try to control it. So that's the second approach. And the third approach is to basically combine the second and the first one, and this is to allow a certain usage, but not on a very short time scale. But instead on a bigger time scale. This could mean that you go off of social media for a month at a point in time, for example, and try to avoid it as much as you possibly can, but not entirely. But you just accept that you eventually will fall into the trap, but nevertheless, you try to avoid it as much as you possibly can by taking a larger time scale and actually scheduling larger points where you actually use social media and other things like this. So first of all, the second point, not the second point, but the first point. What is the first point is to try to avoid social media altogether. So the problem is that the negative effects of social media are only negative. It's not that they're only negative. The negative effects of social media are only the negative effects of social media. And that's what it makes so tricky. If social media was wrong altogether, then it would be very easy because everybody would just try to avoid it as much as you possibly can. But the problem is, of course, it has upsides. Like many things in life, there is no neutral. There is only, this is not what I intended to say, but nevertheless in my mind I just skipped to this part. So what I actually wanted to explain is this. Most things in life are actually on a scale. Almost everything in life is on a scale. On the scale, there are 2 extremes. The left extreme is the one that is maybe, depends on how you view this video, but from my point of view, the left one now is the thing that is probably negative because we use the mathematical linear thing here. And then we have negative aspects. And then right in the middle, where these 2 fingers meet, we have a neutral aspect. That's basically something that is balanced. Balance these 2 things out. These are basically things that we cannot judge. And then, on the other hand, we have the negative, we have the positive. So, in between is basically everything. Because these 2 are extremes, they are defined to be extremes. Extremes should be extremes, therefore are designed to be not reachable. Infinite is a number that is not a number because it's unreachable. You cannot reach infinite. That's the reason it's called infinite. It's not the reason it's called infinite, but it's just the concept of how we view extremes. So, extremes ideals are things we can never really hit because there are extremes. And when it comes to something being on a scale with 2 extremes, the one being the positive and the other one being the negative, then most things fall in between. Almost all things, I would say, fall in between. And even for all the things we would say they are neutral, it's just that we cannot really find out if they are neutral or if they have some positive or negative benefits. For example, right now, when it comes to TikTok and also the other social media video platforms that offer this short form content, we don't really have data on this. We as a human race, and not we as, I just said, there is basically no data on this. And there are almost no experiments where you actually experiment with how TikTok actually affects the minds of people that watch it, for example. So now, when it comes to coming back to the first point now, the first point is to try to avoid social media altogether. The problem is that you probably cannot. Even if you try to avoid it altogether, so many people are actually in social media and so many people are actually already hooked. And it's not that that's one of the main disadvantage. It's not that is one of the main things that keeps you from avoiding social media, but it's just a point. It's just a situation that many people already use social media. And the other factor is this. Social media actually has very many upsides. You can connect with people all around the world instantly. This is something that was never possible at any age and time in human civilization before. just being connected to basically every single person with a cell phone and internet on this earth and being able to call him or her or the person is just something that is incredible. You can basically make a song with somebody on the Eastern Islands in a day. It doesn't really matter in which time scale you actually produce the song. It just, you are able to do these things at this point in time. And this is because of the internet and maybe also due to social media. So social media obviously is a part of this bigger thing we also call the internet. And social media are just platforms that are on the internet and that are designed to be social. So of course, there have been many points about social media that are discussed again and again and again. Have been many points discussed. That's what I wanted to say. But it's not the point of this video to go into the details of the mental health aspects of social media and the long-term benefits or negative sides. But I just want to say that, and I just want to conclude, that it's probably very hard to completely stay off of social media because you basically have to stay kind of off the grid. You don't really have to, but that's the direction you probably are heading in. And it's also a direction of isolation, because if then there is a pandemic and for 2 years you cannot really go out, depending on the country and the current situation of the pandemic, then it becomes harder and harder to actually keep your social environment alive. Also, of course, you can talk to people. You can randomly just drive to people 300 kilometers away or 3,000 kilometers away and see them face to face. But because social media and also all ways of communication that are there, that are possible because of the internet, it just doesn't often make sense anymore to just randomly drive 3,000 kilometers and spending I don't know how many hundreds of dollars or euros to just see this person for 1 hour. And this other person also has to have time at this point in time. So therefore, it's just sometimes easier to just message this person or to just give this person a phone call and just talk to the person without actually having all the setup time and also all the scheduling time of both persons' schedulings lining up at some point in the future. So of course, there are many upsides to social media. What I am trying to say is that it's probably very hard to avoid social media altogether. To some extent, you have to use it. Even, for example, if you are a VR developer, at some point in time, you probably want to actually try out the Oculus and how the Oculus actually, how you game, for example, actually AR or VR, or you just are developing virtual reality games. Let's just say this is the scenario and you want to test out your game on different headsets, and then you have to also use Oculus because that's part of the market share, or the Oculus just has a certain market share in the virtual reality headset game. And then you just, what do you do if you don't have a Facebook account? And this integration between all of these different websites, also allowing you to log in with Google, allowing you to log in with Facebook, it just becomes harder and harder to fight it. Or if you just want to buy a random smartphone, then chances are, in some way or another, the smartphone maker or a software maker that is actually has an app that is installed there just tries to make you addicted, or not really make you addicted, but to make you interested in the things they offer. And this could mean that on Samsung phones or on HTC phones, you have the ability to display a feed of all the news you want to accumulate, or just things like this. And you constantly, if you try to avoid social media and all these other addicting dopamine traps, if you just try to avoid them as good as you possibly can, then you just have to constantly be aware. You have to constantly fight it. And now, coming to the second point, you have to constantly fight it anyway, because it constantly tries to make you addicted to this. Because it's designed to. It's the same with food. So now, let's switch to the second topic, but also kind of expand on this topic of dopamine traps a little bit more. Imagine a bakery, and just imagine a town. There are 5 bakeries, and now within the first bakery, someone discovers that if he actually puts just 5 grams of sugar in, let's say, per 100 grams of dough for making buns, for example, then people buy them more and they like them better because they taste better. And why is this the case? Because obviously it's sweet, but also the sugar in it the 5 grams of sugar in it actually not only make it sweeter, so you don't only become addicted to the taste, kind of, but also the sugar itself, it is just an addicting substance. If the sugar is actually in your gut, it makes you crave more food, regardless of the taste of the food and regardless of the sugar in food. It just makes you crave more food. There have been studies that actually have proven this fact. I don't know if there's an imperfect tense of proved this fact, I guess. So now, this one baker has buns that probably sell a little bit better. Let's just say, for easiness sake, let's just say 5% better. Then, at some point in time, the others will realize that they won't sell as much buns anymore. If before the market share was 20% for each baker, because 100% divided by 5, then the market share of the one that actually has the sugar in the bun dough, goes actually up. And the others will experience this decrease. Of course, we are also assuming this is a zero-sum game. This means there are no developments and benefits that would kind of benefit all of these people. Not all, actually many things on this earth are not zero-sum games. If you think about the economy, for example, and we think about how to distribute money within a state or within a government, often these are not zero-sum games. If you, for example, invest into education, then in the future probably this will give you even a bigger payoff than the invested money. But this was just a random side note, and I don't want to explain it any further. And I just want to leave it like this, even though there are also obviously logic mistakes I just made when randomly making up this example. So let's return to the 5 bakers. The others would realize that there is something this one baker has that makes his buns sell better. And now the others have a problem because they also have families. They don't want their business to actually at some point in the future shut down, because if this development, currently it's just a little bit. It's just a little bit. But what if then some other baker also found out about the secret? And then another one found out about the secret because, well, if 2 or 3 bakers know it, they know each other and sometimes they talk. And of course, they are competition, but they're also friends because they went to bakery school together. So therefore, at some point in time, everybody will use the sugar. So now, if one of these had the idea to increase the amount of sugar by 100%, which results in now 10 grams of sugar. So basically 10% of sugar in buns. Of course, this is not a real-life scenario, but actually, when it comes to McDonald's, for example, and Burger King, at least in the past, I don't know about the current state of burger buns at McDonald's and Burger King, but there used to be sugar in it, as well as there is sugar in many other things, like tomato sauce, like just random pizzas, there's just sugar in it. Or if you just buy these small cucumbers in a glass, there's just sugar in it. If you just buy any kraut, so I don't know the English word for it. For example, blaukraut, I think it's actually also called blaukraut in English. So if you just buy randomly things like these, there is almost always sugar in it. It's just plain. And if you don't try to avoid it actively, there is almost always sugar in these things. Why is this so important? Because let's go back to the bakery example. Now, the first one has the ingenious idea to go up to 10 grams of sugar. And now he has again a competitional advantage. Of course, this doesn't result in the buns or the dough of the buns eventually being 100 grams of sugar. This is not where the optimal point in this function lies. But the optimal point is where the taste maximizes without noticing it's too sweet, probably at some point there, or in the region of this point. Now, what I'm trying to describe is basically the incentive that has been there for hundreds of years to make food more tastier, because then more people like it and more people become addicted to the taste of the food and also just eating the food and also just eating the food at certain times. There have been marketing campaigns that whenever you, for example, go to the cinema, it's not particularly to the cinema, but I once heard about a marketing campaign where they try to basically connect a certain point of the week where a certain show was released to then also a certain food, and this also kind of worked. So now, I mean, it's the same with Christmas, for example. Everybody eats these things before Christmas, and everybody eats, I don't know the words for it, and I don't look it up right now because I want to get this video done. Nevertheless, there are these sweets you eat for a certain period of time. Sometimes it's just an invention by a marketing company, and sometimes, well, it's tradition because, yeah, well, of different things. Now, the point I'm trying to make is, if there is the incentive, if the overall goal is to maximize revenue, which you kind of have to aim for if you want to have a sustainable company, I guess, and a bakery is a company that shoots to be sustainable. Not sustainable in an environmental term, but sustainable in terms of economics. You have to actually make sure your bakery in 25 years, if you want to have this bakery for the next 25 years, actually also brings revenue in. And if other people have developed the methods more and more and actually have then a greater market share, chances are, if it's a zero-sum game, things will go down for your company. So now, the incentive when it comes to the food industry and also when it comes to the social media industry is kind of very similar. The incentive is this, to maximize basically food that is bought. And to maximize not only food that is bought at a certain point in time, but over basically the lifetime of a customer. Not always, but I would say to a certain extent, you want to have the customer actually to go repeatedly into a supermarket, into a bakery, and buy the same things again and again and again. Now, when it comes to social media, it's very similar. There also is the incentive to optimize for revenue, because that's what a company has to do if it doesn't want to go down. And if you then not really for revenue, that's wrong. You want to actually optimize for profit, because you also could have a huge revenue but without any profit. And then if you optimized or maximized profit even more and even more, if you maximized the revenue even more and more and more, this doesn't necessarily linearly correlate with the profit also going up. Therefore, the profit function is basically the bigger function that also includes the revenue function. This is what I'm trying to say. And so both industries have this profit function. Basically, every industry has this profit function, and also you in your life have this profit function. You basically want to increase your well-being over your lifetime. It's basically profiting off of your lifetime as much as you possibly can. Of course, the one thing is money and the other thing is overall well-being over your lifetime, but the concept is similar. You want to optimize one single variable, and you want to optimize this one single outcome or variable because it's the biggest function you can get, and everything else is included in this function. That's the idea. So now, let's compare the food industry to the social media industry or other industries that also are heavily reliant on people actually showing up again and again and again and being addicted, or at least liking to some extent things. So, when it comes to the social media industry now, the current revenue model of a huge part of the internet is still to have ads, to serve you ads, to serve you not as a customer, but much more as a user ads. And now the idea is that the more ads you get served and the more ads you can consume, the more you can actually optimize for profit. Because there are basically two variables. The first variable is how valuable your time actually is as someone who uses these things. If you are a millionaire and you want to decide which bike to buy, for example, or which yacht to buy, then your time on social media is, when it comes to people who sell yachts, more important to somebody who is not a millionaire. And that's just the first thing. That's basically how valuable your time actually is. Your time as the user. And the second thing is how much time there is. So these are the two variables. Of course, there are other variables, but I would just simplify it down to these two. So now, when it comes to getting more profit out of the people who use social media, it comes down to either optimizing for... It's not optimizing. It comes down to basically maximizing screen time, because the other thing is just something you cannot really shoot for, at least in the short term. I mean, maybe there's an utopia in the future where all the companies actually optimize for getting all of these people, optimizing basically for people's well-being over their lifetime. So basically if you would make up a function that optimizes for the well-being of a lifetime, and then you would use this function, and social media also would use this function and not optimize for short-term profit, then maybe. And then more people will actually become more productive, will actually learn more things, and then in the future their time will be more valuable. But that's too long-term thinking for a company that is focused on social media and also only has existed for like 20 years, because that's basically 20 years. In the year 2000, there was the dot-com bubble, and before this, of course, there have been things similar to social media a little bit, and there was email, but social media, as we know it, is basically something it has been developed in the last 20 years, maybe the last 30 years, and before. But social media, as we talk of it as social media now, is Facebook, Instagram, and all these other apps, haven't been there for so long. That's what I'm trying to say. So now, the problem is that the more you get users to watch the things on there, to be on social media, the more ads you can serve them, and therefore the more money you earn. And that's a problem. That's a problem not necessarily for the companies or the people who want to sell products on there, because that's just something that's reasonable, I guess. If you have a product and it just makes sense, because it's now within the optimization function if you are a company. And it's not that companies are evil. Most people actually work in a company. Or most people have to, over the lifetime, produce value in some way to other people, and maybe in the future to artificial intelligences. But producing value is basically the thing we all have to do if we want to get money in return, because we only get money as an exchange unit from other entities, mostly humans. So now, the problem is that social media apps optimize for a maximum amount, or optimize for maximizing the user's screen time, not necessarily screen time, but just interaction time with social media. And it's the same with the food industry, just on a different level, but it just buy as much food from these people as possible over time. So now, we're still in the second thing. And we still have been discussing the second thing, that is to try to live with it. And when it comes to food, you have to kind of try to live with it, because if you are in a city and there are bakeries, and then you are at a train station and it smells sweet, you have to find a way to combat all of these things. Because they are there. They are there, and they will be there, because people at this point in time are addicted to these highly processed foods, to these foods that have been optimized for hundreds of years for a maximum taste experience or a maximum food experience or eating experience over time. Now, when it comes to social media, now the big problem is that if you want to control it, the moment you get into these traps, it's a trap. It's a trap, and it's designed to be a trap. And the moment you get into these things, the moment you tend to crave these things more. So this means if you set aside 1 hour a day and you say, like, in this hour, I can theoretically watch social media things. That's better than watching social media throughout the day and not limiting the usage of at all. It's not that just because there's a problem with this approach to block certain periods of the day, to block social media during certain periods of the day, it's not that just because there's a problem in this approach that the next best solution isn't necessarily better. So what I'm trying to say, and it's kind of hard to explain it in a way that makes sense. Nevertheless, this is true as I possibly can be at this point in time, that just because there's a problem with something, just because one person found something negative, doesn't mean it's not a better solution from the previous point that was just worse. And this is also where we as humans fail so often, because it's basically a psychological effect. And the psychological effect is that we try to simplify the world into very easy models, and then just try to live based on these models because it's easier, because we need less computing power. But what I'm trying to say here, for example, if there was a movie and then there is one negative review that is very negative, this doesn't mean that watching the movie, for example, compared to another movie that's even worse, is worse, because still it might offer things that are overall better than this other movie. The movie was not a very good example, I guess. But now, let's come back to social media. You have to try to avoid it now as much as you possibly can. If you work in social media, or if you work in marketing, then obviously you have to use social media. So now, the idea of the second phase is to go through strategies you can actually apply to make it less addicting. And so now I'm just listing the strategies I have used and I also have experience with, and there are also just maybe the one or other study I have based all of these things I use for myself, these principles I call them, and maybe there is just bigger thinking behind it. Maybe not. Sometimes I have no bigger thinking behind it apart from just trying to make it as good as I possibly can. Try to optimize it, basically. So now, the first thing is, the more you are on these apps, the more they know you. And so now, because most of these apps offer an option that is called, basically, saying you aren't interested in this kind of content, because they all offer this function, what you can do is to make it less addictive. So here's number one, make it less addictive, is to just click on not interested on all the content that is currently displayed. Because then what happens is that now, at this point in time, before you do this, it's very specific. It's tailored to you. The content is tailored to you. But if you now click on all of these things, let's just imagine the 5 fingers represent the 5 things you are interested in. If you click on, oh, this is not interesting, this is also not interesting, and then you do this again, like 5 rounds, then the algorithm is like, oh yeah, but what should we do now? And if the algorithm is like, what should we do now? What it does are usually 2 things. The first is to return to previous iterations of your interests. This could mean that 2 years ago on YouTube you watch different things, and now the algorithm serves you these things again in order to see if you are still interested in these things, if you're not interested in these 5 current things. That's one. But if you then go on and continue to say, oh yeah, but I'm also not interested in these things, the more you say you're not interested in the things the algorithm serves you, the more the algorithm just goes back to baseline. And if you just have a blank YouTube page that is basically just serving you random things, then these are basically trends, these are comedy videos, and these are maybe cat videos. But if you are like a normal person, it's not that this is the assumption, but the assumption is this: the more you say the things that are targeted to you are not interesting, the less they will be targeted to you, and the more they will return to baseline. And that's the average interest of all the people on this earth, or at least of all the people that use social media to a certain extent. And that will be less interesting to you, therefore less craving, less daunting. I think daunting is the word. That's strategy number 1. Strategy number 2 is called time blocking. And this is just blocking all of these pages over time. This could mean that you block them for a year. This could also mean you block them for the next 10 minutes. This could also mean you block them for an entire day, with the exception of maybe 1 hour or 20 minutes in the evening. I have used this concept for quite some time. Here are the results. So basically what I try to get rid of is my YouTube consumption. This began probably when YouTube began to be interesting to me, probably in around 2014, 2015, I discovered that there are TED Talks on there. But the thing is, of course, this TED Talk could be the one thing that changes everything. And this is one of the biggest beliefs, kind of also the psychology of the dopamine mind, you could say. That there could be this one thing. If you just knew about this one thing, if you just found out about this one thing, then everything else would shift in perspective. This one thing doesn't exist. Of course, it could exist, and there are things that are very similar to maybe being the one thing, like solving your finances, like solving the money problem in your life, like maybe finding a partner. Like, it doesn't really matter what it is. The problem with this approach is that you are basing your internal mind, your internal state of mind, on something external. And because you often cannot influence the external things, the external stimuli, or just external events, this kind of often leaves you with nothing to do, with nothing left to do, with nothing left that you can actually do about it, because these are external things, and these are often things you cannot control. You cannot control if there is a pandemic or if there is not a pandemic. They're just things that happen. Of course, what you can do is you can now try to study biology and try to help these people, or try to maybe switch your job to working in a hospital. These are all things you can try to do, but you cannot change the fact that there is a pandemic at this point in time. At least the bigger thing. Of course, you can try to manipulate, and that's what I'm trying to say. There are things we cannot influence, and there are things we influence. And the more you base your state of mind, your basic level, your average level of your state of mind on external things, then it becomes very hard, because you are dependent on all of these external things. So now, returning to time blocking. If you want to kind of have at least some part of the day to be not influenced as much by these cravings, these thoughts, then time blocking is basically the option. And it's also it's basically the result of the first thing. Trying to avoid everything is not possible. Therefore, the second thing is now try to avoid it as much as you think is optimal. Not as much as you possibly can, but you have to know for yourself. If you work with social media, if you work in the film industry, it doesn't really matter. You have to just find the optimal point for you, and this optimal point for you is probably solvable with time blocking, because it just means that a certain part of your life, and this can be an hour this day and an hour in 2 weeks, or this could also be that you don't use social media for 5 years and then you use it again. It's just blocking. If this is your lifetime, then you just block certain parts of this lifetime and you don't use social media, or you try to use it less, or you block certain sites. That's the idea. So, my personal history beginning in 2015 with the TED Talks, for example, you think that this one thing is now the thing that changes everything. And that's basically the beginning of it all. That's the beginning of all of these cycles, you could say. And what I eventually found out is this. The more you make things you want to do easy, the more you do them. And the more you make things you don't want to do harder, the less you do them. That's something that's so basic. Nevertheless, we fail to apply it, or I failed to apply it for quite some time, and still fail to apply it. And I mean, obviously I apply it to some extent, but it's just such an easy principle. But nevertheless, I think it's one of the most basic principles there are, and it's nevertheless so plain, and it's the solution for so many things. The idea I had so many years was that if I was rational, if I was somehow intelligent, this doesn't necessarily mean that I'm above average or below average. I just say that I assume that it's just something I cannot really control. How much intelligence, for example, was given to me at a certain point in time. How much ability for intelligence, because intelligence is made up of different things like knowledge, like the ability to learn new things. And let's not get into the intelligence discussion, but that's just something that's given to a certain extent. So now, I assumed for so many years, if I just had figured out all of these things, then finally I would be able to see that, oh yeah, I just don't go on social media now, or I don't do something that is not something that makes sense on the long term. So now, if we try to implement this principle, then what it looks like is that when it comes to social media, and also when it comes to other things that are addicting, or tend to be addicting, or are designed to be addicting, therefore kind of are addicting, it's not that addicting or not addicting is also something, but most things are either not addicting at all, on the negative, or very addicting, and most things fall in between. It's also just something. I mean, that's obvious, but nevertheless, it's like, oh yeah, and I found this one positive point about this, and I found this one negative. So therefore, yeah, it's just how often people talk, and it's just bugging me, and also how I talk at this point in time, because I have to talk, because this is a talking video. So now, I thought I could control it if I just was able to get this, and maybe just be more intelligent in general and just to be more knowledgeable and having read more books and having studied more, and I don't know, I would see that I would be able to rationally make these choices. I would be able to rationally go into a bakery and buy the healthiest thing in a bakery, which is basically nothing. But now, and therefore you don't go to the bakery anymore. But when it comes to believing or just judging how your own judgment is basically flawed, then we just fail. I failed. I failed so many times and I still fail so many times. A very basic example. If you, for example, have a bad day, often it helps to just go on a run. Why? Because then the hormone levels and the neurotransmitter levels in your brain change. But you fail to foresee this change. You fail to then go on a run because in this point of time, you are not in this state. And you also cannot imagine how it will be to then have run. This is the reason you don't often go for a run. Sometimes you do because you kind of know, because it's the long-term thinking, because it's the more rational thinking. But in the short term, it just doesn't seem to make sense because maybe your dopamine average level is so low that you just don't want to move at this point in time. Now, getting back to the second point now and getting back to how to apply this, I had to realize that I basically, for some part of the day or for some part of the life, or actually in my mind, there is just a child, and this child is also in your mind, and this child could also be called a monkey. And this child is basically the accumulation of all the things we constantly want to do, but they are just not useful to be done. It's basically the opposite of the rational mind, but it's not so much the system one I previously referenced, basically coined by Daniel Kahneman, a psychologist. But now, here is how to apply this. First, you need to realize that there is a monkey mind in you. You cannot cage. You won't be able to make rational decisions at any point in time in your life for the rest of your life. Therefore, you have to find a way to make the things you want to do easier and to make the things you want to do less of harder. And one of these ways is to just use a website blocker. That's very easy. Nevertheless, it saves you a ton of willpower, because also willpower is kind of limited, at least for a certain period of time. There have been studies where people actually had to solve mathematical puzzles and then afterwards decide whether they wanted to eat something that's healthier or something that's less healthy. And the more demanding the mathematical puzzle or problem was, the more they tended to go towards the unhealthy food, because probably, that's the theory, or that's the explanation or the interpretation of these results, is that they had already drained willpower, which is used to keep system 2 running, the rational mind, and to also make us do, basically, to constantly fight all the urges we have. And the more you already used your willpower to constantly fight these other urges, or maybe the urge to just solve this mathematical problem, not solve, but to not solve it, but to just do something else, or to just say, oh yeah, that's stupid. The more you use willpower previously, the less you have afterwards. So in a given day, you have a certain amount of willpower. Of course, you can increase it over time, probably by doing hard things, but the concept that willpower is at least somewhat fixed in a certain period of time seems to be something that makes sense. So now, if we apply this principle and make the things we don't want to do harder, then we actually have to tap into system 2, so the rational mind, to solve these riddles we made up for ourselves, like using a website blocker and then having to type in the password, but the password is not in our password manager, but can be found written in a door that is 300 kilometers away on the North Pole. Then it becomes much harder to actually get into social media if social media is blocked by a website blocker. And that's what I discovered for myself. Using just a website blocker, even though I felt like a stupid little child whenever I set these things up, and also whenever you then want to go on one of these websites and you have to realize that you're just doing dumb things at this point in time. And you're not being rational. That you going onto The Verge, for example, which is a tech blog I read over the years, it just doesn't make sense. Nevertheless, you want to do it at this point in time. And therefore, you have to realize that you are basically, that your mind and the thing you're currently doing is basically just, I don't want to use any word, any swear word at this point in time, but it's what I wanted to use at this point in time to increase, to exaggerate the conclusion of all of this, that you cannot control yourself as much as you would like to, I guess. Now, here is the practical solution. Use a website blocker. I use something that's called Blocksite. This is not sponsored, and this video hasn't been leading to the single point where I now can insert an ad. This is not an ad. I used it for 2 years, but there were some limitations, so I just decided to spend $30. And these $30 are just insane if you think about how much your time is actually worth. If you worked for a company, your wage probably ranges from, let's say, the minimum wage in most countries, 5 to 10 euros, at least in industry nations, I guess, somewhat around 10 euros or $10, and then unlimited or just the average wage, it doesn't really matter. If you just say you spend 2 hours of doing anything, and if you can save 2 hours of doing basically nothing or scrolling through social media and wondering which friend of yours has a better life than you, then $30 is basically nothing. Of course, you still have to have the $30, but I basically just bought it and now it works. When it comes to data privacy, it's a horror. It's a dystopian world in where you and everything you type on your computer can be, and also has to be, basically searched. Because you are a dumb child at this point in time. And you have to realize this. And this is not something that is very easy to do, because it's an assumption that is not within anything that you think of yourself, that makes you not very proud, I guess. So, and also, usually you give these apps, these blockers, permission to read everything that's written on the screen. This could also mean your banking details, and I mean, it's just horror if I even think about it. But the other option is that I cannot control my social media use again, and this is also horror, I guess, because this brings also my mind in a completely different state, and it's just choose one of these two evils. Which one do you choose? So now, I use Blocksite. It works also as an app. It also can block apps on your phone. This can mean if you then install Instagram again and you want to open it, then it's just, blocked. And there are basically two things you now can do. The first one is to use a password. And obviously you don't now use a password that is very easy to remember, and you also try to not remember the password because you want to make it as hard as you possibly can to not go into the Blocksite app and then, I just unblock all of everything. And so using a blocker, either for trying to avoid it as much as you possibly can, or to avoid it and try to live with it with some capacity, which you have to do anyway. So now, one iteration was that I just said 30 minutes of my day I can do whatever I want, and 30 minutes of my day I can go on YouTube and search for anything. I did this iteration of this whole system for a few months. What this resulted in is that I basically made lists, for example, throughout the day, which things I had to actually research, like how to use Cubase or how to use a certain program, and there were no good blog articles about this. And sometimes you just need to see something, you just need to see a screen recording, because it's just so much easier, because the information just is so much better. Because you just see how it's done compared to, here's a screenshot, here are the next 10 screenshots, and often it just makes sense to have access to YouTube, for example, in order to randomly do things. Or if you have to do anything, YouTubing it now is a thing. Because there have been people over the last 10 to 20, 30 years that have been recording things that they found solutions for, and now these solutions are partially in the web, and you can actually search them, and you can find them by typing these things into Google, into YouTube. So what I found myself is that I made lists, and I spent this time much more wisely. Like, I only have like 10 minutes left, so let's actually watch this one. And so it becomes much more of a planned process. Therefore, it switches from from the monkey mind much more to the rational mind, and oh yeah, I have to see this, and yeah, maybe just watch something for fun, and then the 20 or 30 minutes are already over again, and yeah, well, then you just accept it because it's part of your day. And also, this is also a very nice principle I found to be working also for other things. If you, the avoid it for the rest of your life approach often doesn't really work. Why? Because the monkey mind is too strong. And also, there is this angst, there is this fear of not ever being able to experience this thing again, which then creeps up in you and is like, oh yeah, but I can never do, and life is so... When it comes to, for example, what are examples I can actually use? I try to avoid sugar for a certain period of time, and this is also the reason why I dove into this topic, because it's relevant to me. And I did it basically for 2 or 3 years straight, without actually making an exception. And then I made one exception, and then it evolved into something, and I just blew the whole thing off. Now, what I wanted to say is that if I now try to quit sugar again, there was this fear in me, this fear of the monkey mind that, oh yeah, but I also want to try all these new things, and if I go to another country and then there is something that is like with sugar and I cannot taste it, and I will rob myself or my future selves of all these experiences I could theoretically, all these things, just they combine in your head and then they become so large, and therefore it doesn't really make sense to try to say to yourself or to the monkey mind, like, you cannot do this ever again. This doesn't really make sense. But you instead have to trick yourself. And this, again, it sounds stupid, but that's how it kind of works. You have to trick yourself into believing that you still can do it, even though you know that it doesn't make sense to ever do it again. When it comes to sugar, for example, the obvious solution is sugar is part of a diet. If you just leave out all the things, all the food products where sugar is in it, then you just cut out. It's basically not really because of the sugar. Of course, it's also because of the sugar. But if you just get all the foods where sugar is in it and you just leave them out of your nutrition, then you made a major step, and you just use this very simple rule and don't have to actually dive into nutritional profiles and all of this, and when to eat and what exactly to eat and when to cook and what the nutritional profile in general is and how much. It just breaks down this very complicated task into a very simple rule, and this rule is avoid sugar. Now, when it comes to avoiding things in general, this principle that you are looking forward just to the next thing that is within the day, for example, is the thing I also used when I used this time blocking with YouTube, for example. I just said, I have this certain period of time, and whenever I had a craving for just randomly watching something, or I just had this thought about, oh yeah, I need to research this for some reason, then I knew when I could. I basically had, instead of a dark place where there was no light, I had this light at the end of the tunnel, and the end of the tunnel was the evening, where I had this unblocked time and I could actually search these things on YouTube. So there was basically, whenever I had one of these thoughts, there was an automatic direction this thought actually should go into. And this automatic thought direction is something that is very useful. And that's also something I used for other parts of my life as well. Just having an automatic response, basically, or training yourself with an automatic response to all of these different things makes decisions very easy, because you then don't have to do them anymore. Now, that's decision automation, basically. And that's also what you do by introducing a blog site. And not a blog site, but a website blogger. It's decision automation. It's saying, oh yeah, I made this decision already previously in the past at some point in time, and now I don't have to. Basically, think of all the decisions you would have to make, of all the little urges you would have to fight for the rest of your life. And now if you get a website blogger, for example, it's only one example, of course, for fighting these urges, then you eliminate all, at least to a certain extent, all these little decisions where you actually would have to use willpower to dampen your urge down to a level where you can actually continue working, studying, whatever you are doing. So you basically just, by making this one decision, you cut out all the necessary willpower in the future, and this future willpower becomes accessible in the capacity of your future willpower for a certain period of time, like a day. And this is one principle. Just using a time blocker or a blocker to avoid these things. And this is one principle that works. It works because it makes these things harder. It works because it makes these things, it basically, from the monkey mind, the monkey is like, oh yeah, let's just do this again. But the monkey actually has to ask basically the parent, if the parent is the bigger authority, to have access to this. And because you then have to think with system 2, the rational part of you, that, oh yeah, I have to actually go into my document or into my password manager, and I don't have it in my password manager, but it's there and there and there. You have to use your rational mind. And if you then, instead of the monkey mind thinking, already go into the rational mind thinking again, then it's like, oh yeah, why do I even do this? It's not that this always happens. It's just, it becomes more likely that you will second adopt your choices. Here's another very easy approach. For years, I tried to... So, in my childhood, I didn't really watch a lot of movies or series. And I also didn't play a lot of computer games, for example. And I still, to this day, haven't had a period where I played excessively computer games. Because it's just, I could either play... I had these very practical examples for myself from a very early age, which was I could play, for example, an hour the guitar, or I could go play an hour with a friend, or I could go out and play soccer for an hour. And if I just sat inside, then I would just leave the computer again, and nothing happened. I didn't play soccer. The only thing that happened was in my mind. Of course, when it comes to solving problems and also thinking in general, just because there hasn't been anything happening in the real world doesn't necessarily correlate with nothing happened. Because the more and more we tend to be a civilization, or humans tend to be, the more intelligent and the more developed human civilization gets, the more it all becomes a brainy thing, just a mind thing, and not changing anything in the real world anymore. And maybe just in the future being hooked up to a better computer and just solving random things. I don't know what the future will look like. But what I was trying to say is that I avoided video games. And I never regret this decision. Whenever I just felt sick whenever I played video games. After it, I just knew that I could have done something else. And this urge, basically, this urgency, which is not an urge that makes you do stupid things, but this urge that you could literally die the next day. You could have cancer the next day, or it could be discovered that you have cancer, or something else, or you could get run over by a car, and then you wouldn't have done all these things. I think if you have this feeling, this good or bad feeling, whenever you do something, or of course this can also be hugely distorted, but if it's something that makes sense, for example, feeling sick after you played a computer game, then you could use it to your advantage and just avoid these activities that make you feel sick. So now, when it comes to movies, here's a similar approach. I try to basically completely ban them out of my life. And this was pretty much 1.5 years ago. I then went on and made a few exceptions, and these were like not big exceptions. This means that basically in 2020 I watched like, I don't know, maybe 30 movies, which it's just there. I basically had one phase where I watched more movies, and then I just went to the cinema once again. That was it. And since then I haven't watched a movie up to a certain point in time, a few weeks back. And this meant that for almost all of a year, I now, or basically do 3/4 of a year I haven't watched a movie or a series. Like classical things, like TV series. And I also haven't spent more than 10 minutes in front of a TV in this time. And you just realize after a certain time, after the cravings go away, the same with food, that you don't need it. And then you can lead a life without all these urges. And that's what's so nice about these things, that you cannot, if you are still in this loophole, that you crave all of these things, and again, back to social media, you think you cannot really live without it. You cannot imagine yourself not checking Instagram. Like, every time you check Instagram and you don't want to do it, it's basically robbing you of the ability or of the knowledge of your ability to actually do the things you want to do, because you don't really want to do it. If you think about it twice, it would be dumb. And if you then continue to do it, what you're doing is you're basically eroding your self-confidence. Minute by minute, hour by hour, day after day. And now, what would happen if you just had somehow, if you could just somehow make it work, that you wouldn't do these stupid things. These things, not necessarily that these things are inherently stupid. It's just that by opportunity cost, you could do something better with your time, or you also already planned something better with your time. And by using these principles we already discussed at this point in time, you can just make it easier to do the right things and harder to do the things you don't want to do. And this was the second part. And I, at this point in time, forgot what the third part was. I have to be honest, I forgot it. And I also... So, let's just make... I think maybe it was to draw a conclusion and to actually find then a solution for what you actually could theoretically do with this information, and also just with these maybe realizations. And let's just try to make a third point that is a concluding point. So now, what you have to realize, I think, and this is also what I had to realize, of course I am just projecting my own experiences onto you at this point in time, but it's, when it comes to these things, that's one of the things I can do. I could also read on studies. I read a lot of these studies. Not really I read these studies, but I sometimes listen to people talking about these studies, which is also not reading these studies. Nevertheless, I try to implement these things. Sometimes these people wrote books, like Daniel Kahneman, and I read the book, or I listened to the book, or people like Andrew Huberman, also a very nice podcast, and also a YouTube channel, which I can recommend when it comes to these topics and actually understanding how your brain responds to these different things. And now, let's try to draw a conclusion. The conclusion is this. Realize that there is a monkey in you, and you will not be able to tame this monkey if you just think that there is no monkey in you. From the moment on you realize or accept that there is a monkey in you that does stupid things, whenever you don't pay attention with your rational mind, or whenever you're drained of willpower, whenever there is no willpower left anymore at the end of the day, for example, that it will become more likely for this monkey to take over. Of course, it's not. The monkey is, again, just an ideal. It's not an ideal in the sense of an ideal, it's just an extreme. On the one extreme is the monkey mind, the negative thing, the dumb thing. And on the other side is the rational mind that does only super rational things. Of course, it's not how it works, but this is just a visualization. It's just breaking it down into the mathematical model where on the one side there are the stupid things and on the other side there are the rational things you can do. And if you now accept that you have these flaws, it's not about accepting flaws in general, it's about accepting that you probably will do stupid things if you are in these situations again and again and again. If you, for example, go into a sweet store where the only thing that is sold are sweets, or if you go into a bakery where the only thing that is sold is probably made out of grains, and also things that have sugar in them, or like, I don't want to get into the nutritional aspect too much, but if you go to a bakery, instead of going into the whole food section of a supermarket, for example, chances are you will buy something that is compared to something like a cucumber less nutritional beneficial to you. And what it all comes down to is basically this bigger concept of choice architecture. It's choice architecture. Again, choice architecture. It means that you are the architect of your own choices. But if you then, the other opposite would be that you don't try to architect your choices of the future versions of you, that you will probably make less good choices compared to the ones you would be able to do if you architected your choices. This is the principle it all comes down to. Choice architecture is nudging people into different things. Choice architecture is using a block site or a website blocker to not give yourself access to things. Choice architecture is to try to not buy junk food, because if the junk food then is not at home, then the hurdle of getting the junk food is just getting to the supermarket. And does it actually make sense then to also spend an additional 30 minutes and maybe $5 to $10 on something just because you had a craving for a pizza, for example? It's less likely that you will do the thing. That's just choice architecture. By not allowing yourself to access social media throughout certain parts of your life, day, hours, I don't know in which scale you actually want to schedule these things. If you try to avoid, for example, movies altogether, then it just becomes easier and easier and easier, because the more you also avoid these things, the easier it becomes to avoid these things. The more, for example, you go onto a nutrition that is called keto, which is low in carbs and also low in sugars, the more you will not crave these things anymore. Also your mind and also your stomach, bacteria, for example, will adjust. And the same is kind of true for social media. The more you tend to avoid things that spike your dopamine level, then basically the dopamine system rewards you whenever you do them, the more your average dopamine actually goes up again. What usually happens is, if you have these highly processed versions of reality, like junk food, like social media, where every single picture is probably edited and doesn't look like this in real life, doesn't look as good, the location doesn't look as good, but probably there were clouds on this day and then somebody just edited the sun in, for example, or just made it more sunny by applying a filter that is warmer in tones. It doesn't really matter what it is. What I'm saying is that if you heighten reality up to a point, and the heightening reality is the bigger concept I could find for all of these different parts in which this applies, then the dopamine that is released for something that is already would already be rewarding is just bigger. And now think of it like this. For a certain time, this could be a week or a month, your body makes sure that you have just a certain amount of dopamine. Now, if you have these dopamine spikes, then in a very short period of time, you have these dopamine spikes. If now the overall level of dopamine, not level, but the amount of dopamine that is released and that is circulating with our system should be constant over a certain amount of time, then what your body has to do in the times whenever you don't have a dopamine spike is to intentionally lower the dopamine to a lower level than it would usually be, to then have the same average again. If you had a sinus curve, for example, like this, and you took the average, then the average would be probably in the middle. But if you now increase the amplitude of the positive parts of the sinus curve, then you equally have to decrease or basically increase the amplitude of the negative parts of the sinus curve in order to have the same average, because otherwise the average would move up. And that's the problem with dopamine. If you have these dopamine spikes, and that's the reason, that's basically the biggest concept, the highest level of abstraction we can get, because all of these areas are very similar, whether it comes to junk food, whether it comes to also maybe social interaction in general, whether it comes to social media, whether it comes to movies, whether it comes to something like TikTok. Of course, something like TikTok is also in social media already but that's the bigger principle behind it. Your average dopamine becomes lower, and then you just feel like shit. Because that's what the dopamine system is designed to do, kind of. The higher your level in dopamine, the more you will feel like, oh yeah, let's just do this. And the less your level of dopamine is, the more you will feel like, oh yeah, I don't want to even move. Dopamine makes you move. Dopamine makes you go and do the activity that is related to the thing you want to achieve. And that's basically as high of a level as this can go. And therefore, just keep in mind these 3 things, or maybe 4 things. First, accept that there is the monkey mind. The monkey mind is basically based in the dopamine system. The dopamine system influences your rational thinking to a bigger extent than you probably will acknowledge or want to acknowledge. The second part is that you cannot really completely avoid it, therefore you have to find a way to live with it. Therefore you have to find a way to make it harder to actually again get these dopamine spikes. Because then what this means is that otherwise you will have these dopamine lows in between. And if you don't want to have these dopamine lows, then you have to find a way, again the second point, to live with it and live with it, and to find a solution, find the most optimal solution that works for you. And the third big point is, the bigger principle is choice architecture. Whenever you are in a bright moment, then you have to architect your choices in a way, the future choices of you in a way that benefit your future, all the future versions of you that will ever exist. And that's the conclusion I want to draw. And it's also 65 minutes already, but I just wanted to make this within one. And if you made it this far, then chances are I helped you to a bigger extent than I would have if more people watched it. And yeah, I don't want to compare these things, so it doesn't make sense. Therefore, that's the end.